clear and that everyone can hear me and all that lovely stuff. Any problems in that regard, then please feel free to put your challenges in the chat. Thank you, Carrie. That's very helpful. Carrie's put in the chat that we're here and we can hear, and that's great. Anything else that you'd like to put, please feel free to put it in the chat. And my colleague, Chris, will keep an eye on that for us. It's great to have people here. People are still just arriving. I guess it'll take people a couple of minutes maybe to get logged on and that kind of thing. So just before I start the webinar, just to say that this is the first in what we hope is going to be a series of webinars aimed at people who are who've maybe recently got a diagnosis of autism, or are on the pathway maybe towards diagnosis, or sort of exploring diagnosis, or even people who are sort of further down the line, maybe have had your diagnosis for a while, but you're still trying to get your head around things, or it's basically just a way of us being able to kind of share information, and also to come together as a group of people with this thing in common, to kind of to share what we've learned and to support each other. I was diagnosed, I think it's 20 years ago this year, and I've worked in the field of autism really all my adult life. So I've gone through a long process of learning things, figuring things out, and had to do quite a bit of that for myself, and as a community. I think we've been through that process in the sort of last 20 or 30 years, and I think that being able to share this, the information, what we've learned, what's worked for us, things like that, is probably one of the greatest privileges, really. So that's certainly why I'm here to do it. I'm a peer development worker with Leeds Autism AIM. I probably should have said that at the beginning. And one of the parts of my job is working with people who have just very recently got a diagnosis of autism, sort of helping you to sort of find your feet when you've just had this piece of information about yourself, this kind of piece of the jigsaw revealed to you. Should say that we're recording the session today, or to clarify, we'll record the session while I'm talking. I'm hoping that towards the end of the session there'll be a chance for discussion or question and answer. We won't record that bit. It's not fair to put people on the spot like that, but the recording of my part will be available to people after this session as well. So we are recording. I am just going to start my slideshow, and then I think we're good to go. Can everybody see the slides okay? Could somebody just give me a yes, Chris?
I can see the slides.
Right. I'm going to assume everything's fine with the slides, unless people say otherwise. Just one thing, I do have a tendency with Zoom, because obviously if I move the slides on myself, or if I just carry on talking and you don't think I've moved the slides on, just feel free to say, Jill, you're on the wrong slide or something. But anyway, we should be all good. So without further ado, what are we going to discuss in today's webinar? Well, we're talking about autism and identity, and what it means to kind of be autistic, and how we might, the various different ways in which we can make sense of that as a part of who we are. And so we're going to start by thinking about what we mean by identity and how it relates to autism. Going to think about the impact of an autism diagnosis on how we see ourselves. Some of the things that I'm talking about will will also be relevant to people who are self-identifying or who are on the process of diagnosis or on the pathway. Some of the things that we will think about will be more specifically to do with the actual process of being diagnosed. We wanted this session to be inclusive of people who are kind of pre-diagnosis and on that pathway. So so hopefully it'll make sense what's what, but some of the things are specific to the process of being diagnosed. We're going to think about how others see us and how that impacts our sense of identity, including the concept of minority stress and some of the work that's been done in relation to minority stress and autistic people. And finally, we're going to think about the idea of autistic community and how autistic community can contribute to individual well-being and self-esteem for autistic people. And we're going to look at some of the research about how autistic community can help people. I think it's really important to say at this point, though, that when I talk about things like what we mean by identity, the impact of things and things like that, I'm certainly approaching this with the assumption that there is no one right or wrong way to feel about yourself. We're all individuals and we all have the right to self-determination and the right to dictate how we understand ourselves and how we make sense of ourselves, and that includes how we make sense of our autism. Sometimes I think within the autistic community there can be sometimes a tendency for us to become maybe dictatorial in terms of wanting to put forward the right idea of autism and what it means to be autistic. And I've obviously certainly got my own ideas about that, but I'm adamant for the likes of this talk that when it comes to individuals and how we make sense of ourselves, we have the right to determine that for ourselves. So none of what I'm saying should be interpreted as meaning that I'm putting forward a right or a wrong. I'm just discussing some of the research and some of what I've discovered along the way. One of the reasons why I really wanted to do this, to do these webinars and to start with this topic of autistic identity, is because my experience as an autistic person across the last couple of decades has been that so much of the focus of research and discussion around autism and around ideas of how to support autistic people is based on aspects of autism that affect how we impact other people and how other people see us, particularly our family, our parents, but also in terms of employment and education and things. What's received less focus, I think, is how we feel about ourselves and how things like receiving a diagnosis of autism, going through that process, can impact how we feel about ourselves and how we see ourselves. So that's why I feel it's a particularly important topic. I just need a drink of water. 1 second. That'll serve me right for eating pecan nuts just before talking for an hour. So, first of all, I'd like to start by thinking about the idea of autistic people where we fitted in society kind of across time. The idea that, you know, we've always been here, we've always been part of society, but how we've been understood as a section of society has changed very much over time, including the fact, obviously, that for most of human history, the idea of autistic and of autism has been a sort of an unnamed phenomenon. We haven't had the vocabulary to talk about autism and being autistic. But nevertheless, we can certainly look back through history and we can see how aspects of what we would now commonly call autism have been part of society and part of kind of what's moved society on and what's made society into what it is and made humans into who we are and things and our sort of place within the world. So just quickly to point out that some research has suggested that autistic traits such as pattern recognition might have had kind of clear advantages in hunter-gatherer societies. So examples here include the first kind of 100,000 years of Homo sapiens. There might have been advantages arising from ability to distinguish animal footprints from random impressions by a river, for example, or to tell edible plants from poisonous ones, to pick up bird distress calls as early warning of large predators, for example. Likewise, a study of cave art from the Paleolithic period, which is harder to say than it sounds, suggests that some autism-related traits may have played a key role in pushing forward human evolution. Also, the idea, the suggestion that most of the what we might call less adaptive traits of autism are dependent on environment, while others are a constant with different social explanations. Right. This is all very, this is something that we can move on from anyway. It's just some kind of interesting ways of seeing how there's been kind of evidence for autistic people and the idea of kind of an autistic population or part of the human population has been kind of evident throughout history, but maybe the ways in which we've been seen or seen ourselves might have changed dramatically over time, moving towards the bottom point of the bullet points there, moving towards being seen as a minority identity group, part of a wider disability minority movement, and towards a social conceptualization of the impact of disability. So that's the idea that rather than focusing kind of exclusively on aspects of disability as being kind of intrinsic to the individual, so things to do with a disability, such as, you know, what we might think of as symptoms, thinking also about the impact of society on disabled people, the differences in opportunities that a person might have if society doesn't accept and cater for their impairment, and kind of including autism in that sort of that framework. So the idea that certainly the idea of an autistic identity has might have changed dramatically over time. So starting then to think about what we mean by identity, it's probably easiest to divide identity into kind of two components that kind of fit together. So the first part might be your personal identity. So that's defining yourself according to your individual characteristics and how this definition influences your choice throughout life. So, for example, you might choose a career that aligns with strengths that are common to autistic people. So yeah, that's focusing. Your personal identity is focusing on characteristics that are attributed to you as an individual. Alongside that, there's social identity, which is belonging to particular social groups and how that influences your sense of yourself. So, for example, feeling connected with other autistic people might have an impact on how you feel about yourself as an individual. So it's that idea of connectedness and belonging with your social group, and that's going to be quite relevant to what we'll see about the idea of autistic community and how it can impact us, and some of the research on that we'll think about at the later. And it's important to think as well that that aspects of identity are dependent on context. So that includes the influence of of surrounding views on autism. The impact of those surrounding views can also impact on how we feel about ourselves and how we understand ourselves and our personal identity. And they're also kind of reciprocal. They interact with each other. So, for example, it's been found that a weak autistic personal identity, so sense of yourself as an autistic person, leads to weak solidarity with other autistic people. I think that makes sense if you're a person who doesn't particularly see yourself as being autistic, or you don't see it as a particularly central part of who you are, then you're probably not going to feel so much that you have a lot in common with other autistic people, or that you feel the need to be in contact with other autistic people. And certainly throughout my work with autistic people, I've met a lot of people who kind of feel like that. They'll say, well, I accept that I'm autistic, but it's not really a big part of my life. It's not something I think about a lot. I don't feel the need to hang around with other autistic people. I like who I like, and I spend time with who I want to spend time with, but I'm not fussed about them being autistic. And on the other hand, I've met people, and I know a lot of people who would say, being autistic is central to who I am because it informs everything else about me. And I find it a lot easier to be with other autistic people. And that's kind of a core component of who I am and how I kind of make sense of myself and who I am. And yeah, all of those, those different sort of ways of making sense of ourselves as autistic people and as members of an autistic community exist, and every sort of every point in between them exists as well. And we develop our own sense and what's right for us as we go, and also that'll change probably dramatically over time for a lot of us. I know, for example, from experience of people that I've known, often when you're younger and maybe you've only just got your diagnosis, you don't necessarily want to identify too closely with autism, or you don't feel ready to, you don't know if it's appropriate to. And then as you move through life and maybe you develop more sort of personal confidence, such that you don't mind standing out as a person, that'll change. And also as you move further away from your diagnosis and you start to get your head around what it means to be autistic, you'll feel more comfortable being with that being part of your identity. So certainly development and change around your autistic identity is I would say very common and probably a very healthy thing, actually. So yeah, that's what I'm meaning about when I talk about identity. It's how you understand yourself, who you are, and how that influences your life choices. And then it's how you understand the social groups that you belong to and how you feel connected with other members of those social groups. So what does it mean to have an autistic identity, and how can getting an autism diagnosis impact things like self-esteem? Well, there was a study done which suggested that which looked at self-esteem and psychological well-being and personal identity among adults who'd received a diagnosis of autism. It was interested in experiences of what they called autism as part of me. And it found that the greater the time that had elapsed from diagnosis, so further away after diagnosis, there was less dissatisfaction with autistic identity. People began to sort of accept it more. They found that autistic pride was a concept that predicted or was seen to lead to greater self-esteem, with negative feelings about being autistic being related to low self-esteem. Of the 54 qualitative responses, so that was answers to a question, kind of free form answers to a question, they supported these findings and suggested that there was an emotive post-diagnostic adjustment process. And the research suggests a complex journey after diagnosis, with things like the understanding of self developing, but also and feelings of being exonerated in quotes for perceived failings, but also learning to navigate stigma. So it's a complicated process. You're on the one hand, you're feeling, you're thinking back through life and you're thinking about things, times when you were maybe misunderstood, times when you were perceived to have done things wrong, when really it was out of your control or you didn't understand what you'd done wrong. And it turns out that now in the light of your diagnosis, it turns out that those things were outside of your control. It turns out that it's a part of your neurotype. It wasn't being naughty or bad or whatever people might have been called at school, or stupid, or any of the things that those labels that people might have had attributed to them or might have attributed to themselves. So it can be kind of a relief in that sense. But it can also be a period of learning to navigate the world as an autistic person. And that can include, unfortunately, learning to navigate stigma. So the way in which the social world around you sees you as an autistic person might be quite different to how they saw you before they knew that you were autistic. So things like when you're applying for a job, if you have to decide whether or not to tell your prospective employer that you're autistic, you might feel that you should, to be able to ask for adjustments or accommodations, but you might have a sense of trepidation about that because there's a risk of discrimination, be it kind of you might not get the job, or be it that people might have negative impressions of you or things like that. So it's a complex time, and it can bring a lot of mixed feelings for people. I often describe it, I use the phrase, it's like a roller coaster when I work with post-diagnostic clients with AIM, because it can be up and down. And I think one of the key things is to kind of accept that it is a big deal, in inverted commas, and to kind of allow yourself to have those reactions. so that you don't get that kind of secondary feeling, sort of beating yourself up for feeling bad about something, that secondary level of stress that can come along with that. I know that in the past, certainly in my experience, there'd be a tendency for people, say family members of someone who's been diagnosed, to say things like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change who you are. You're still the same person to us." And those things, while being comforting and well meant, sort of trying to minimise the negative impact of a diagnosis, can also be quite difficult to reconcile with how the experience can feel to you. If to you it does feel like a big deal, it does feel like a lot in your life has changed, and there's a lot to be made sense of and a lot to kind of get your head around. And it can feel sometimes you can feel as though your response to the diagnosis might be kind of a bit overblown if people are telling you that it's not a big deal. And that's especially a difficult thing for those of us who have often been told that our feelings are unusual or atypical, kind of as an inherent part of being undiagnosed autistic. So I think it's important that we kind of sort of trust the process and accept that, you know, for some of us, this is a big piece of information, and it'll take time for us to get our heads around. But as the research that I mentioned on the last slide suggests, with time comes a greater sense of acceptance and an affirmation. So I mentioned that it's a kind of a journey, kind of going through diagnosis and sort of the process and after the process. And it can bring a lot of different feelings, a lot of different feelings in the sense that different individuals might approach the experience differently, but also within ourselves, different feelings from day to day and according to, you know, what's going on in our lives at the time. But these are all, these examples that I've put on the following slides are all things that I've heard a lot from autistic people who are newly diagnosed. So I wanted to kind of be able to think about these things together, because I think it can really help in times like this to know that we're not alone, and that our response to a thing like getting a diagnosis, while obviously unique to us as individuals, will have a lot in common with the people around us, and that, you know, we're maybe not as atypical as we might have been led to believe. You know, it's that thing of being very normal, just being a very normal autistic person, you know, and that maybe being slightly different than being a normal neurotypical person. So some of the things that came up in Corden, Brewer and Cage's research about this this journey of diagnosis and what it meant to people were, firstly, that the diagnosis, somebody says, led me to reevaluate my life. It changed everything. Things finally made sense. Someone said they felt relieved, but also somebody was upset and confused and angry. I think that was to do with having realised that they'd been misunderstood for so much of their life, up to the point of diagnosis. And on the third point, somebody's kind of echoed that. They said, sometimes now I feel a bit sad about my autism because I know I'm always going to find things difficult. And likewise, the next point says, it confirmed I was different and would never be normal. So sometimes there can be that sense of almost like a grief for the loss of who we thought we were, and what we, you know, and things that we thought might have been possible for us to overcome. It can feel sort of limiting to know that maybe we have impairments that are going to impact us kind of forever. Someone said it took time, but I read around a lot, learned online. Mostly I've learned from other people online about how to help myself. And somebody else, again, this idea of kind of looking back, somebody said, why hadn't autism been picked up sooner? It was a double-edged sword, though, as it also caused anger since no one had noticed for so long. And then there's something about the way that other people kind of understand the diagnosis. So people said my diagnosis is fake. People do not understand autism. That's something I hear a lot from people, that that they get their diagnosis and they try and tell people around them, but people around them have a very fixed idea about what autism is and what it should look like. And if the person in their life, the person who's been diagnosed, doesn't fit that stereotype, it can lead to them being kind of disbelieved, or ideas that either that autism itself isn't a kind of a reliable diagnosis, or that the person is kind of exaggerating things, or playing on things. And lastly, I was very self-conscious and lost confidence. Sometimes it feels lonely. I do not always feel like I have much in common with other autistic people, so I'm not always sure where I fit in or belong. That's another thing that some people can feel, that they've kind of realized that they maybe don't fit in with many neurotypical people, and they can want a real sense of the autistic community to be somewhere where they belong and they do get on with everybody. And if they have experiences of not feeling confident or comfortable with the autistic people that they come into contact with, it can feel kind of doubly alienating, which can be a challenge, because of course we don't all get on with everybody. We don't all get on with each other, including in the autistic community. Just because you're autistic and another person's autistic, of course, doesn't mean that you're going to get on. There's said to be more variation and heterogeneity, so difference between people within the autistic community, than there is between autistic people and neurotypicals. We're a very varied bunch, and we can often be quite sort of extreme in our personality traits. So if we are different to each other, we'll probably be very different. So yeah, sometimes we're not always going to obviously get on with each other just because we're autistic, but that can feel very alienating when we're in the early stages of getting our heads around diagnosis and when it's new to us. So just a few other things, some more positive things. Someone said, I'm learning to be proud of my autism, or autism is an attribute. It's just part of, it's a facet of who I am. Someone else said, I'm more confident asking for accommodations, so self-advocating. By being able to advocate for my needs, discrimination that happened in the past happens less after the initial denial of services. So that's often somebody might have had to battle for adjustments and accommodations, and when they finally get them, that can be a real relief. Someone says, this is how my brain works. I fully embraced my neurology. I give myself space to be me. I'm letting myself be the real me. I think that's a big thing that people begin to feel when they've either had a diagnosis or realized, accepted that they themselves are autistic. That it's a sense of being able to kind of to accept who they are. Maybe sometimes to feel like less pressure to what we might call mask or camouflage. The idea of the real me, or the kind of authentic me, coming forward can be something that people feel strongly about. But some people also feel that that's very hard to do, that they don't know who the authentic them is, and they don't know how to stop masking or camouflaging, and that can cause people some distress as well, in my experience. And lastly, somebody said, it's good to know why I felt different. I think probably the diagnosis has helped me more than not, as I know myself better. Obviously, with all those things that I've said there, some are kind of specific to diagnosis, but a lot of them will apply also to people who begin to identify themselves as autistic and are kind of content with the self-recognition part. So I'd include both of those categories in those points. Thinking briefly about how others see us, because of course a big part of how we see ourselves and how we make sense of who we are is contributed to by how other people see us and the kind of vibes we get from other people. Some things that have come up, the ones in black, I put in black they're a group that I put together of sort of things that belittle the impact of the diagnosis. So I don't see you any differently since your diagnosis. And the dreaded, aren't we all a bit autistic though? That idea of kind of it belittles the impact of what being autistic is. And then the orange ones are kind of ones that suggest a negative idea of autism. So they reflect the idea that autism is a bad thing. And if people said those things to you, you would probably be likely to feel that the person who said them to you had a bad idea about what autism was, saw it as a negative thing. So why would you want to identify with your disability though? And why would you want to make yourself into a victim? And then the bottom one, you seem more autistic since you were diagnosed. That's a common one that a lot of people find their family members will say to them, in my experience. And then a couple of the purple ones are ones that are a category of the idea of people having a set idea about what autism is, having sort of preconceptions about what autism is. And, if you tell them that you've received a diagnosis or that you think you might be autistic, they'll say these things to you, and it gives an impression that they're not believing you. So firstly, you don't seem autistic to me, or my friend's son is autistic and you're nothing like him. Sometimes those can be quite kindly meant as a way of kind of trying to reassure you that there's nothing quote unquote wrong with you. But that's often not how people receive those kind of comments. So thinking about the idea of minority stress, this is just some research that Monique Botha and David Frost have done in the last few years, and I think it's an interesting or a helpful concept. It builds on the idea of autism as like being a neuro minority, so a minority group in the same way that you can be in a minority based on your sexual orientation or your ethnicity. And it's particularly helpful, I think, because, as they say, so much research in relation to autism over the years has been looking at the idea of things that are intrinsically wrong with autism and with autistic people, whereas the idea of minority stress is looking at our place kind of in the social world and how the pressures of the social world can cause some of the challenges that we face. So just this first slide is just some very sort of brief summaries of what they mean of what the idea of minority stress means. So it looks at the idea, it takes the idea of labeling, suggests that labels such as autism absorb the meanings that society gives them, and it says that that there's been research that suggests that 9 of the top 10 terms used by non-autistic people to describe autistics are negative, which means obviously that we're getting a lot of negativity about this part of our identity. And the concept of minority stress, which was originally used to explore experiences in relation to sexual orientation or race, it's commonly used to explain disparities in physical and mental health that are based on those minority characteristics. So being a member of a certain minority group might lead you to have disparities. Disadvantages in your physical and mental health compared with the general population. And just a few points, there's 4 premises that this is based on. So firstly, not all differences are discrepancies. So with the example of age, there's an increase in the effect of an illness with age that might be expected. So we expect to kind of feel illnesses more acutely as we get older. So therefore, that's not something that you would attribute as kind of a discrepancy based on being a member of a minority. It's what you might think of as a natural thing. So that's not what they're talking about. Secondly, the idea of minority stress, it's based on the law of averages and average effects. So, for example, just because a member of a certain race is unaffected by a particular disadvantage, it doesn't mean that the theory as a whole kind of it doesn't falsify the whole theory. So, typically how people use a single example of a particular, say, a famous person of a particular race and say, that they seem to be doing fine, so therefore there's no such thing as racism or whatever. It's based on across the whole population. And thirdly, the theory applies to overall health, your overall picture of physical and mental health. It's not talking about specific disorders. So it's not talking about specific particular groups being prone to specific disorders. It's about your picture of kind of overall health. And fourthly, finally, it's about the disadvantage that's produced by exclusionary social hierarchies rather than anything specific to that group. So it's about the fact that, for example, a group that you're a member of might be devalued constantly on the basis of societal norms, and that constant process of being devalued has an impact on the physical and mental health of members of that group. It's not talking about, so for an example that comes to my mind is, for example, sickle cell disease in Black people wouldn't be an example of what's being talked about here. It's about social disadvantage. And moving on to talk about, these are some of the things when Botha and Frost did their research on whether minority stress was a thing for autistic people. They did a survey of 111 people who self-identified as being autistic, and they found that these were some of the experiences that led to an additional stress burden being faced by autistic people. And these included victimization, discrimination, everyday or covert discrimination, which is sometimes called microaggressions. So they're just the kind of the little everyday things that are, not maybe like being turned down for a job because you're autistic, but maybe just working in an environment where you hear negative things about autistic people a lot, for example, and it kind of chips away at you. Expectations of rejection, and that is correlated, so related with the idea of microaggressions, and that makes sense if you think about it. If you're hearing negative things about an aspect of your identity constantly, you probably will expect to be rejected by it. It's a sort of, it would make sense to you that you would be rejected based on something that you hear negative things about all the time. Outness. So, how open we are about the fact that we're autistic. Interestingly, in relation to autism, outness in this study was associated with having poorer mental health, which is interesting because in the original research on minority stress in relation to sexuality, outness was seen as something that contributed to better mental health. So, being more open about your sexuality was a way of developing better mental health. The authors of this study suggest that maybe it's because autistic people who are more out about their autistic identity are hearing more negative things and being rejected, experiencing more rejection as a result of their autism. So that's having kind of a stressful effect in ways that maybe don't these days apply to sexuality. So that's maybe something that might change over time. But certainly at the moment, that's the case. And then the last two are internalized stigma and the physical concealment of autism, so basically masking or camouflage. And this they suggest that minority stress as a result of these factors is a possibly preventable factor in mental health and well-being disparity facing the autistic community. So we know, for example, that that there's a lot of evidence of poor mental health and challenges across the autistic community, be that anxiety or depression, and the tendency has been to sort of attribute those to the nature of autism itself. But what this research does is it begins to widen that view and suggest that there might be other factors to do with society around us. I think it's important that it's not saying that, autism or being autistic itself doesn't have an impact on physical or mental health. It doesn't go as far as saying that. What it is saying, though, is that all the impact of all these things, these social factors, can have an impact on us. And I think that's powerful because these are all things that can be challenged. This is the kind of, to me, this is where the politics of autism comes in. This is where our kind of work and our fight comes in to try and make the world better for us and for those autistic people that come after us. And then finally, my last slide is to finish on a kind of a hopeful note, because I know that it can be really depressing to come to a talk about autism and just hear a load of negative stuff. I've done that myself and it's a bit miserable. And also it kind of reinforces the idea of, minority stress and, hearing negative things about ourselves and our identities. And I don't want to do that. I want to be realistic about some of the challenges that we face, because I think if we're not realistic about things, we don't confront them, then nothing's going to change. The garden is not rosy for members of the autistic community at the moment, but it's good to finish on a positive. So this is where I want to finish, because there's an increasing amount of research now about how being part of an autistic community can have an impact, a positive impact on our mental health and well-being. Back in the day, back in the kind of, the sort of decades around the time when I was being diagnosed and before that, the kind of received wisdom was actually that it was a bad idea to put autistic people together, because was said to make us more autistic. You know, for example, putting two autistic children together who'd then sit and stim together, or you know, play alongside each other in sort of what seemed to be autistic ways, that was seen as a bad thing. So the idea was to keep us apart. It apparently made the autism go away. That was sarcasm, by the way, in case it wasn't clear. Whereas now, research, particularly such as that which Catherine Crompton has done, indicates that actually we are pretty good by and large at, or at least as good as the neurotypical population, at interacting with each other and at building rapport between each other. It's just that we don't do that as well with neurotypicals, or maybe more accurately, neurotypicals don't do it very well with us. But certainly as an in-group, we can build community, and that community with other autistic people, by and large, can have a positive impact on us. One of the studies that I looked at for this, the title of it, I've quoted on here, it said, "I never realised everybody felt as happy as I do when I'm around autistic people," which I think can just really sum up what some of us can really how some of us can really benefit from being around other autistic people, and the positive impact that that can have on our mental health. And I think yeah, so this I put another couple of points on the slide. I'm sorry I'm jumping around these points, but some of the reasons why that can be beneficial are because we can develop an autistic identity. We can also kind of model aspects of our culture. So, for example, how to self-advocate around like sensory needs and things. Seeing other people do it can kind of encourage us to try for ourselves rather than trying to have to do it on our own all the time. We can build a shared vocabulary. So things like masking, stimming, things have become a shared sort of language that we now have to describe our experiences. And we can build rapport and get that good sort of buzz that can come from that. Obviously, this doesn't this comes with some caveats, and it's important to bear in mind that, you know, it doesn't necessarily, there are lots of reasons why an individual person might feel that they are not ready for or don't want to take part in autistic community. For example, it might just not be the right time for them, or they might have, they might have, as I mentioned before, there's a big variation among us as a group, and they might not have met autistic people that they want to interact with. It's not something that should be forced based on diagnosis, which is something that I've come across happening sort of support settings. You know, those two people are autistic, they must be put together. I'd hate it if kind of this sort of research led to that, but it does vindicate the idea that we can do quite well together and support each other. And I think the development of our identity, individually and collectively, is a big part of that. And I've included all the references on the slides in case anyone wants to go through and look through anything afterwards. I think the slides are going to be sent afterwards and going to be available along with the recording. That is all I have to say. I'm 5 minutes over where I wanted to be, but I'm going to stop sharing my slides now,